Picture this: a rugged cowboy forced into marriage by a cruel bet. A woman who's never known love, and a single moment that transforms two strangers into something neither saw coming. What happens when pride, desperation, and unexpected tenderness collide in the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge? This is the story of Calder and Pearl, a love that began with laughter and grew into legend. Before we dive into this incredible journey, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's begin. The autumn sun hung low over Cedar Ridge, casting long shadows across the dusty main street as another day of back-breaking ranch work came to an end. The Broken Wheel Saloon buzzed with the familiar sounds of cowboys drowning their soreness in whiskey and their loneliness in loud conversation. Smoke curled toward the tin ceiling, mixing tobacco with the scent of sawdust and spilled beer. Calder Boonwell pushed through the batwing doors, his boots heavy on the warped wooden floor. At 32, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd spent half his life breaking horses and the other half fixing what they'd broken. His weathered hands bore the scars of honest work, and his blue eyes held the steady gaze of someone who'd learned to read both animals and men with equal precision. "Well, look what the wind blew in," called out Jake Morrison from his usual spot at the bar. The red-headed cowboy's grin was as wide as his ego and twice as annoying. "Our very own confirmed bachelor Calder Boonwell." A chorus of laughter erupted from the group gathered around Jake. These were the same men Calder worked alongside every day, branding cattle and mending fences under the merciless Texas sun. But here, with whiskey loosening their tongues, they became something else entirely. A pack of wolves sensing weakness. "Leave it alone, Jake," Calder muttered, signaling the bartender for his usual. The amber liquid burned just right, going down, cutting through the dust that seemed permanently lodged in his throat. "Can't leave it alone." Jake continued, his voice carrying across the saloon like he was announcing the winner of a horse race. "Man's 32 years old and never been married? Hell, I don't think he's even courted a woman proper." The truth of that statement hit closer to home than Calder cared to admit. It wasn't that he was afraid of women. He just hadn't found one who could tolerate the long silences, the early mornings, and the simple life he'd carved out for himself. Most of the eligible ladies in Cedar Ridge were looking for men with steady incomes and social standing. Not cowboys who smelled like horses and preferred the company of cattle to church socials. "Maybe he's waiting for the perfect woman," suggested Tommy Williams, a young hand who still believed in fairy tales. "You know, like in them books his sister used to read." "Perfect woman," Jake snorted. "Hell, at his age he ought to be grateful for any woman willing to put up with his ugly mug." More laughter filled the air, but Calder noticed it had an edge now. These men weren't just teasing anymore. They were testing him, pushing to see how far they could go before he pushed back. It was the same dynamic he'd seen play out countless times in the corral when a new horse was introduced to the herd. "You know what I think?" Jake stood up, swaying slightly from the whiskey. "I think our boy Calder here is scared. Yellow-bellied, scared of women." The saloon went quiet, except for the mechanical ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of a harmonica from the hotel next door. Every eye was on Calder now, waiting to see how he'd respond to having his courage questioned. Calder set his glass down carefully, his jaw tightening. "I'm not scared of anything, Jake." "Prove it then." Jake's eyes glittered with malicious glee. "I dare you to marry the next woman who walks through that door, tonight, before the sun comes up tomorrow." The challenge hung in the air like gun smoke. A dare. The kind of foolish, pride-driven proposition that had started more fights and ruined more lives than all the whiskey and bad cards combined. But it was also the kind of challenge that a man couldn't walk away from. Not if he wanted to show his face in this town again. "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard," Calder said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Scared?" Jake pressed. "Come on, boys, let's make this interesting. I'll put up $50 that says Calder won't do it. Anyone else want to bet against our brave cowboy?" Money started appearing on the bar, crumpled bills and silver coins that represented weeks of hard work. The men were betting against him, assuming he'd back down like any sensible person would. But sensible had never been Calder's strong suit, especially when his pride was on the line. "What if no woman comes through that door?" Calder asked, surprised to hear himself even considering the insane proposition. "Then you're off the hook." Jake grinned. "But if one does, you marry her, tonight. No matter who she is, no matter what she looks like, no matter if she's older than your grandmother or crazier than old Pete's mule." The terms were laid out like a death sentence. Calder looked around the room at faces he'd known for years. Some encouraging, others skeptical, all of them waiting to see what kind of man he really was. His father had always said that a man's word was his bond, and once given, it couldn't be taken back without losing something essential. "All right," Calder heard himself say. "But the same goes for all of you. If I do this crazy thing, none of you ever question my courage again. Deal?" Jake extended his hand. "Shake on it." Their hands met with the solid grip of men sealing a pact, and Calder immediately wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. The other cowboys whooped and hollered, already planning how they'd spend their winnings. For the next hour, they waited. Men came and went through the saloon doors, but no women appeared. Calder began to hope that maybe he'd catch a break, that the universe might spare him from this particular brand of stupidity. But just as the clock struck 9, the doors swung open again. Pearl Delaney stepped into the Broken Wheel Saloon, carrying a worn leather satchel and wearing a practical brown dress that had seen better days. At 28, she was what polite society called a substantial woman. Tall and broad-shouldered, with curves that defied the current fashion for tiny waists and delicate features. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her green eyes held the determined look of someone who'd learned to rely on herself. The saloon fell silent as a tomb. Pearl was well known in Cedar Ridge as the woman who sold healing creams and remedies from her small cabin on the edge of town. She was respected for her knowledge of herbs and her fair dealing, but she was also the subject of whispered conversations about spinsters and women who'd let themselves go. "Evening, gentlemen," Pearl said in her clear, strong voice. "I'm looking for Sheriff Coleman. Someone said he might be here." Jake's grin was so wide it looked painful. Well, look what we have here." Calder felt his stomach drop to his boots. This was really happening. He was going to have to ask Pearl Delaney to marry him right here in front of God and everybody because of a stupid dare and his own stubborn pride. "Sheriff's not here, Miss Delaney," called out the bartender. "Went home to his supper about an hour ago." "Thank you." Pearl nodded politely. She started to turn toward the door, but Jake's voice stopped her. "Hold on there, Miss Pearl. Our friend Calder here has something he'd like to ask you." Every head in the saloon turned toward Calder. He could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Pearl looked at him with polite curiosity, having no idea that she'd just walked into the middle of the most ridiculous situation of both their lives. Calder started, then stopped. How did a man even begin such a conversation? "Miss Delaney, I was wondering if... that is to say..." "Spit it out, boy," someone called from the back of the room. Pearl's expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Are you feeling all right, Mr. Boonwell? You look a bit peaked." The kindness in her voice made everything worse. Here was a decent woman who'd never done anything to deserve being dragged into this mess. And he was about to make her the punchline of a joke that would follow them both for the rest of their lives. "Miss Delaney," he said, his voice stronger now, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The words hung in the air like a physical thing. Pearl blinked once, twice, then looked around the room, as if trying to determine whether this was some elaborate practical joke. "I beg your pardon?" she said finally. "He's asking you to marry him, Pearl," Jake called out, unable to contain his glee. "Right here, right now, tonight." Pearl's eyes returned to Calder's face, searching for something he wasn't sure he could give her. "Are you quite serious, Mr. Boonwell?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, surprised to find that he meant it. Whatever had started this moment, he was committed to seeing it through with as much dignity as he could muster. "I am absolutely serious." The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. Calder could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, could see the pulse jumping in Pearl's throat as she considered his proposal. The entire saloon held its collective breath. "Why?" she asked simply. It was the one question he couldn't answer honestly, not without humiliating both of them. He couldn't tell her about the dare, about the bets on the bar, about the fact that his pride had painted them both into this impossible corner. "Because," he said slowly, choosing his words with the care of a man defusing a bomb, "I think you're a fine woman who deserves a husband who'll treat her with respect." It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Pearl Delaney was a fine woman, respected in the community for her work and her integrity. If he had to marry someone based on a foolish dare, he could do a lot worse than a woman who'd built her own business and never depended on anyone else for her livelihood. Pearl studied his face for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. "And you believe you could be such a husband?" "I'd try my best, ma'am." Another silence, during which Calder became acutely aware of every sound in the room. The scrape of a boot on wood, the clink of glass on glass, the soft wheeze of the old man sleeping in the corner. "Very well," Pearl said finally. "I accept." The saloon erupted. Men shouted and cheered. Money changed hands, and someone started playing a ragged version of The Wedding March on a battered piano. But Calder barely heard any of it. He was too busy staring at Pearl, wondering what in the hell they'd both just gotten themselves into. "Should we find the preacher, then?" Pearl asked, practically as if accepting spur-of-the-moment marriage proposals was something she did every day. "I'll get Reverend Patterson." Tommy Williams volunteered, rushing toward the door with the enthusiasm of someone who'd had a front-row seat to the most exciting thing to happen in Cedar Ridge in months. While they waited for the preacher, Calder found himself standing awkwardly beside Pearl, acutely aware that he knew almost nothing about the woman he'd just proposed to. He knew she made her living selling herbal remedies and that she lived alone in a small cabin. He knew she had a reputation for being fair in her dealings and knowledgeable about healing. But he didn't know her favorite color or whether she liked her coffee strong or weak or what made her laugh. "This is quite unexpected," Pearl said quietly, her voice meant for his ears alone. "Yes, ma'am, it surely is," he agreed. Do you have any regrets already?" She considered the question seriously. "Ask me again in a year." Despite everything, Calder found himself almost smiling. Pearl Delaney might be many things, but she clearly wasn't the type to panic or fall into hysterics. That was something, at least. Reverend Patterson arrived within the hour, looking harried and slightly confused, but game to perform whatever service was required of him. He was a kind man in his 60s who'd seen enough of life to know that love came in many forms, and that sometimes the most unlikely marriages turned out to be the strongest. "Now then," he said, looking between Calder and Pearl. "Pearl, are you both certain about this? Marriage is a sacred covenant not to be entered into lightly." "We're certain, Reverend," Calder said, though he was anything but. "And you, Miss Delaney, you're entering into this union of your own free will." Pearl straightened her shoulders. "I am Reverend Patterson." The ceremony itself was brief and surreal. They stood before the preacher in the middle of a saloon that reeked of whiskey and tobacco, surrounded by cowboys who were either cheering or counting their losses. Pearl's hand in his was warm and slightly rough from her work, and when she spoke her vows, her voice was clear and steady. Do you, Calder James Boonwell, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part? I do, Calder said, and meant it more than he'd expected to. Do you, Pearl Margaret Delaney, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part? I do, Pearl replied without hesitation. Then, by the power vested in me by the state of Texas and Almighty God, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. The kiss was awkward and brief, more of a polite touching of lips than anything romantic. But it sealed their fate as surely as if they'd signed their names in blood. They were married now, bound together by law and custom and the words they'd spoken before witnesses. The cowboys erupted in cheers and congratulations that felt both genuine and mocking. Drinks were bought all around, toasts were made, and Jake Morrison slapped Calder on the back so hard he nearly knocked him over. Well, I'll be damned, Jake laughed. You actually did it. Never thought I'd see the day when Calder Boonwell got himself hitched. Neither did I, Calder muttered, accepting another whiskey he didn't really want. As the evening wore on, the reality of what they'd done began to sink in. He was married, to a woman he barely knew, because of a dare that had seemed like a good idea at the time, but now felt like the height of stupidity. Pearl, for her part, seemed to be handling the situation with remarkable composure. She accepted the congratulations, graciously deflected the more invasive questions about their sudden courtship, and generally conducted herself like a woman who'd planned this evening, rather than stumbled into it by accident. Where will you be living? Asked Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, who'd arrived late but in time to witness the ceremony. Your cabin is quite small, Pearl, and Calder's been boarding at the ranch. It was a practical question that neither of them had considered. Calder rented a small room above the general store, while Pearl's cabin was barely large enough for one person, let alone two. We'll figure something out, Pearl said diplomatically. You could always expand the cabin, suggested Doc Morrison, Jake's more sensible older brother. Add on a room or two. Pearl's got enough land for it. As the evening progressed, more practical concerns arose. Where would they live? How would they support themselves? What about Pearl's business? The questions came faster than answers, highlighting just how unprepared they were for the reality of marriage. Perhaps we should discuss these matters privately, Pearl suggested when the questions became too pointed. They stepped outside onto the saloon's narrow porch, leaving behind the noise and smoke for the cool night air. The street was quiet except for the distant sound of a dog barking and the creak of the hotel's sign swaying in the breeze. This is quite a mess we've gotten ourselves into, Pearl said without preamble. Yes, ma'am, it surely is, Calder agreed. I want you to know that I'll understand if you want to have this whole thing annulled come morning. What happened in there? It wasn't fair to you. Pearl was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the empty street. Can I ask you something, Mr. Boonwell? Calder, he corrected. I reckon if we're married, you can call me Calder. Calder, then. Why did you really ask me to marry you? And please don't tell me it's because you think I'm a fine woman. We both know this was about something else entirely. He could lie to her. It would be easy enough to make up some story about sudden infatuation or divine inspiration. But looking at her profile in the moonlight, seeing the intelligence in her eyes and the way she carried herself with quiet dignity, he found he didn't want to start their marriage with a lie. It was a dare, he said simply. Jake dared me to marry the next woman who walked through the saloon door. I was too proud and too stupid to back down. I see, Pearl said, and he couldn't tell from her tone whether she was angry or hurt or relieved to finally know the truth. "I'm sorry," he continued. "You got caught up in something that had nothing to do with you and that wasn't right. If you want to pretend this never happened, I won't fight you on it." Pearl was quiet for so long that Calder began to think she was planning her escape. When she finally spoke, her words surprised him. "I accepted your proposal for my own reasons," she said. "I'm 28 years old, Mr. Boone Calder. In the eyes of this town, I'm already an old maid. I have no family, no prospects for marriage, and no one to care what happens to me when I'm too old to work. Marrying you, even under these circumstances, gives me something I've never had before." "What's that?" "Security. A husband. A place in respectable society instead of existing on its margins." Her honesty was as stark and uncompromising as the Texas landscape. She wasn't pretending this was about love or attraction or anything romantic. She was treating it like a business arrangement, which Calder supposed it essentially was. "So what do we do now?" he asked. "Now we try to make the best of it," Pearl said practically. "We're married for better or worse, as the good Reverend said. The question is whether we can find a way to live together without making each other miserable." "I'm not much for talking," Calder warned her. "I get up early, work hard, and I don't have much use for social gatherings or fancy things." "And I'm not much for taking orders or having my business interfered with," Pearl replied. "I support myself, I make my own decisions, and I won't be treated like a decoration or a housekeeper." "Fair enough," Calder said. It was perhaps the most honest conversation about expectations he'd ever had with another person. "Should we shake on it?" Pearl actually smiled at that, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her all evening. "I think we've done enough handshaking for one night." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while, two people trying to process the fact that their lives had just taken a dramatic turn based on pride, practicality, and a moment of mutual madness. "Where will you sleep tonight?" Pearl asked eventually. It was another practical question that highlighted just how unprepared they were for the reality of marriage. They were legally husband and wife, but they were still essentially strangers. "I can stay at the boarding house," Calder offered. "Give you time to adjust to the idea before we figure out the living arrangements." "That seems wise," Pearl agreed. "Perhaps we could meet tomorrow to discuss practical matters, where to live, how to manage our respective work, that sort of thing." "Yes, ma'am." "Pearl, that sounds like a good plan." They walked back into the saloon to collect their things and say their goodbyes. The crowd had thinned somewhat, but those who remained were still in high spirits, treating the newlyweds like celebrities. "You taking your bride home, Calder?" Jake called out his words, slightly slurred from whiskey. "Mrs. Boonwell has business to attend to," Calder replied evenly. "We'll be seeing each other tomorrow." If anyone thought it was odd that a newly married couple was spending their wedding night apart, they kept their opinions to themselves. Pearl gathered her satchel and shawl, accepted a few more congratulations, and prepared to leave. "Thank you," she said quietly to Calder as they stood by the door. "For being honest with me, for treating me with respect, for not making this any more difficult than it had to be." "Thank you," he replied, "for saying yes. For not making me look like a complete fool in front of half the town." "Well," Pearl said with a slight smile, "the night's still young." With that, she walked out into the darkness, leaving Calder standing in the doorway of the saloon, married to a woman he barely knew, and wondering what the hell he was going to do next. The remaining cowboys gradually dispersed, heading home to their own beds and their own problems. Jake was among the last to leave, pausing beside Calder on his way out. "You really did it," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "Married Pearl Delaney on a dare. Never thought you had it in you." "Neither did I," Calder admitted. "She's a good woman," Jake said more seriously than Calder had heard him speak all evening. "Might be the best thing that ever happened to you, even if it started as a joke." "Might be," Calder agreed, though he wasn't sure he believed it yet. Alone finally, Calder walked slowly toward the boarding house, where he'd been renting a room since he'd started working for the Double R Ranch. The streets of Cedar Ridge were quiet, most of the respectable folks having gone to bed hours ago. Only the saloon and the hotel showed any signs of life, yellow lights spilling from their windows onto the dusty street. As he walked, Calder tried to process everything that had happened. This morning, he'd been a bachelor cowboy with no responsibilities beyond his work and no ties beyond his job. Tonight, he was a married man, bound to a woman he respected but didn't love, committed to a future he couldn't even imagine. The boarding house was dark, except for the lamp Mrs. Patterson always left burning in the front window. Calder let himself in quietly, not wanting to wake the other residents. His room was small and spartanly furnished. A narrow bed, a washstand, a chair, and a trunk that held all his worldly possessions. It suddenly seemed inadequate for a married man, though he supposed Pearl's cabin wasn't much bigger. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled off his boots, his mind still reeling from the evening's events. Pearl Delaney was now Pearl Boonwell, his wife, in the eyes of God and the law. The woman who'd walked into the saloon looking for the sheriff was now bound to him until death parted them. What kind of woman accepted a marriage proposal from a virtual stranger? The same kind he supposed who asked a woman to marry him because of a dare. They were both taking an enormous risk, betting their futures on the slim chance that mutual respect and practical considerations could grow into something deeper. Calder had never been much of a gambling man, preferring sure things to long shots. But tonight, he'd made the biggest bet of his life, wagering his future happiness on the hope that he and Pearl could build something worthwhile together. Only time would tell if he'd chosen wisely, or if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. As he finally lay down to sleep, Calder found himself hoping that Pearl was having similar thoughts in her own bed, wondering what tomorrow would bring, for two strangers who'd become husband and wife on a dare. The last thing he heard before sleep took him was the distant sound of the church bell chiming midnight, marking the end of the most extraordinary day of his life and the beginning of whatever came next. Réveillez TS Part 2. Louis Viet Tintin Transcendent Dimension từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề. Tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phù. Phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Modifier The Morning Sun painted Cedar Ridge in shades of gold and amber. As Calder made his way down Main Street, his boots echoing against the wooden boardwalk. Sleep had come fitfully, filled with dreams of wedding vows and green eyes that seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed defenses. Now, in the harsh light of day, the events of the previous evening felt both impossibly real and utterly surreal. He'd arranged to meet Pearl at her cabin at 10 o'clock, a meeting that felt more like a business appointment than anything resembling a honeymoon. The thought made him grimace as he passed the general store where old Mrs. Henley was already sweeping her front steps and casting curious glances in his direction. "Morning, Mr. Boonwell," she called out, her voice carrying just a hint of something that might have been amusement. Or should I say, congratulations are in order. Word traveled fast in a town the size of Cedar Ridge. By now everyone would know about the wedding, though Calder suspected the details would grow more colorful with each telling. He tipped his hat politely and kept walking, not trusting himself to engage in conversation just yet. Pearl's cabin sat on a small rise about half a mile from the town center, surrounded by the herb gardens that supplied her business. As Calder approached, he could see her moving about in the yard, tending to plants with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to make every moment count. She wore a simple blue dress and a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows across her face. But even from a distance, he could sense the tension in her shoulders. "Good morning," he called out as he reached the gate, not wanting to startle her. Pearl straightened and turned toward him, her expression carefully neutral. "Good morning, Calder. You're punctual." "Yes, ma'am. Always try to be." She studied him for a moment, and he found himself wondering what she was thinking. Did she regret her decision? Was she planning to ask for an annulment? The uncertainty gnawed at him more than he cared to admit. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked finally. "I was just about to put a pot on." "That would be fine, thank you." He followed her into the cabin, ducking slightly to clear the doorframe. The interior was small but meticulously organized, every surface serving multiple purposes. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of dried herbs and bottles of various remedies. A work table dominated one corner, covered with mortars and pestle scales and other tools of her trade. The air smelled of lavender and something else he couldn't identify. Something green and growing. "Sit wherever you'd like," Pearl said, gesturing toward the small table that served as both workspace and dining area. "Though I'm afraid the accommodations are rather limited." Calder took the chair facing the window, partly because it gave him a view of the herb garden and partly because it put his back to the wall. An old habit from his days working cattle in less civilized territories. Pearl moved about the small kitchen area with practiced efficiency, measuring coffee and water with the same precision she probably used for her remedies. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night," she said without turning around. "About the practical matters we need to address." "And what conclusions have you reached?" "Several." She set the coffee pot on the stove and finally turned to face him. "First, the living situation. This cabin is barely adequate for one person, and your room at the boarding house isn't suitable for a married couple. We need to find something larger." Calder nodded. "I've been thinking the same thing. There's a house on Maple Street that's been empty since the Johnsons moved to San Antonio. Might be available for rent. I know the place. 2 bedrooms, decent-sized kitchen room for expansion if needed." Pearl's businesslike tone made it clear she'd already considered the option. "The question is whether we can afford it on our combined income." "What do you make from your remedies, if you don't mind me asking?" Pearl hesitated for a moment, then seemed to decide that marriage, even one based on practicality, required a certain level of honesty. "On a good month, about $40. Less in winter when people aren't as prone to the kinds of ailments my remedies treat." Calder whistled softly. It was more than he'd expected, certainly more than most women in Cedar Ridge earned from their own labor. "I make $35 a month from the ranch, plus room and board. If we're paying rent instead of boarding fees, we should be able to manage something decent. Assuming, of course, that we can tolerate living in the same house without killing each other," Pearl said dryly. Despite everything, Calder found himself almost smiling. "Well, I suppose that remains to be seen." The coffee began to percolate, filling the small cabin with its rich aroma. Pearl busied herself preparing cups and setting out a plate of what looked like homemade biscuits. The domestic scene felt strange and familiar, at the same time as if he were glimpsing a life that might have been his under different circumstances. "There's something else we need to discuss," Pearl said as she poured the coffee. "The nature of our arrangement." Calder felt his stomach tighten. This was the conversation he'd been dreading, the one that would determine whether their marriage was merely a legal fiction or something more substantial. "I'm listening," he said carefully. Pearl sat down across from him, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup as if seeking warmth. "We're married in the eyes of the law and the church, but we're essentially strangers." I don't expect... That is, I understand that certain aspects of marriage might not be immediate. She was blushing now, a pink flush creeping up her neck and into her cheeks. Calder realized she was trying to discuss the intimate side of marriage without actually saying the words, and he felt a surprising surge of protectiveness toward this woman who could face down skeptical customers and hostile townspeople, but stumbled over conversations about marital relations. "Pearl," he said gently, "I want you to know that I'll never force myself on you. What happened between us last night, it wasn't fair to either of us. If we're going to make this work, it has to be because we both want it to, not because the law says we're married." The relief in her eyes was unmistakable. "Thank you. I was hoping you'd feel that way, but I wasn't certain." "We'll take things as they come," Calder continued. "Get to know each other. See if we can build something real out of this crazy situation we found ourselves in. And if we can't, it was a fair question, though, not one he was eager to contemplate. Then we'll figure that out when we come to it. But I'd like to think we're both practical enough to make this work, even if it's not what either of us planned." Pearl nodded slowly. "I can agree to that. A trial period of sorts." "How long?" 6 months, she said without hesitation. "If we can stand each other for 6 months, we'll know whether this has any chance of lasting." Calder extended his hand across the small table. 6 months it is." Their handshake was firmer this time, more confident. They were entering into this agreement with their eyes open, knowing what they were risking and what they might gain. "Now then," Pearl said, her businesslike manner returning, about the house on Maple Street. "Should we go look at it today?" "I don't see why not. The sooner we get settled, the sooner we can start figuring out how to live together." They finished their coffee in relative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the enormous step they were taking. Finally, Pearl stood and began clearing the table. "I should change into something more suitable for house hunting," she said, "and gather a few things in case we decide to take the place immediately." "I'll wait outside," Calder offered. "Give you some privacy." He spent the next few minutes examining Pearl's herb garden, impressed, despite himself, by the variety and organization of her plantings. Rows of lavender alternated with patches of chamomile, while mint and sage grew in neat borders around the cabin's foundation. It was clear that this wasn't just a hobby for Pearl. It was a carefully planned business enterprise that required considerable knowledge and skill. "I'm ready," Pearl announced, emerging from the cabin with a small valise and a different hat. She'd changed into a green dress that complemented her eyes and made her look less severe than the brown one she'd worn the night before. The walk into town gave them another opportunity to talk, and Calder found himself asking about Pearl's business. How had she learned about herbs? Where did she get her supplies? How had she built up her customer base? "My grandmother taught me," Pearl explained as they walked. "She was what folks called a wise woman back in Missouri, where I grew up. People came to her for remedies when they couldn't afford a doctor or when the doctor couldn't help them. And you came to Texas to continue her work." "I came to Texas because there was nothing left for me in Missouri after she died," Pearl said matter-of-factly. "She left me her recipes and her knowledge, but the other women in town thought I was too young to take her place. They made it clear I wasn't welcome." There was pain in her voice, carefully controlled, but unmistakable. Calder found himself wanting to know more about what had driven her to leave everything familiar and start over in a place where she knew no one. "That must have been difficult," he said. "Starting over in a new place." "It was," Pearl admitted, "but it was also liberating. Here I could be whoever I chose to be, not just someone's granddaughter living in her shadow." The house on Maple Street was exactly as Calder remembered it. A modest 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and a decent-sized yard. It needed some work, but the bones were solid. Mrs. Peterson, who owned the property, was delighted to show it to the newlyweds, gossiping cheerfully about their sudden romance while pointing out the house's features. "The kitchen's been updated recently," she said, opening cabinets to display their spaciousness. "And there's a good well in the backyard, plus room for a garden if you're so inclined." Pearl examined everything with the thoroughness of someone who understood the value of careful inspection. She tested the pump in the kitchen, examined the windows for drafts, and even checked the stability of the stair railings. Calder found himself watching her more than the house, impressed by her practical approach to what many women would have seen as a romantic milestone. "The rent would be $25 a month," Mrs. Peterson said as they finished the tour. "That includes water rights and use of the root cellar." It was steep, but not unreasonable for a house of this size and condition. Calder looked at Pearl, who gave him a barely perceptible nod. "We'll take it," he said. "When can we move in?" "Immediately, if you'd like. I'll just need the first month's rent and a small deposit against damages." As they walked back to the boarding house to collect Calder's belongings, Pearl was quiet and thoughtful. He wondered what she was thinking about this latest development in their rapidly evolving situation. "Having second thoughts?" he asked as they reached the boarding house. "No," Pearl said, though she didn't sound entirely convinced. "It's just, this morning I woke up in my own cabin with my own life exactly as I'd planned it. Tonight I'll be sleeping in a strange house married to a man I barely know. It's a lot to process." "We could slow things down if you want," Calder offered. "There's no law that says we have to live together immediately." Pearl shook her head. "No, you're right. The sooner we start adjusting to this new reality, the better. Besides, people will talk if we don't live together. They're probably already speculating about why we spent last night apart." Calder's possessions fit easily into 2 saddlebags and a small trunk. Looking at the meager collection of clothes books and personal items, he felt a moment of embarrassment about how little he had to contribute to their new household. Pearl, on the other hand, would need help moving her business supplies and furniture from the cabin. "We'll need to hire a wagon," he said as they prepared to leave the boarding house, "to move your things properly." "I can handle the smaller items myself," Pearl protested. "I don't want to put you to any expense." "Pearl," Calder said, stopping in the middle of the street. "We're married now for better or worse. Your expenses are my expenses and my expenses are yours. That's how this works." She looked startled by his vehemence, then slowly nodded. "You're right. I'm not used to depending on anyone else, but I suppose I'll have to learn." The wagon rental and the move took most of the afternoon. Calder was amazed by the sheer volume of Pearl's business supplies. Jars, bottles, dried herbs, equipment, and reference books that revealed the depth of her knowledge. By the time they'd moved everything to the house on Maple Street, both bedrooms and half the kitchen were filled with the tools of her trade. "I'll need to set up a proper workspace," Pearl said, surveying the organized chaos they'd created. "The kitchen table won't be adequate for mixing large batches." "We could clear out one of the back rooms," Calder suggested. "Turn it into a dedicated workspace for your business. You wouldn't mind? It would mean the smell of herbs and the noise of grinding and mixing." "I work with cattle," Calder reminded her. "I'm not easily bothered by smells or noise." As evening approached, they found themselves in the strange position of sharing their first meal as husband and wife in a house that didn't yet feel like home to either of them. Pearl had managed to prepare a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, using her portable cooking supplies, and they sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, making awkward conversation about practical matters. "I'll need to let my customers know about the move," Pearl said, "and probably introduce you to some of them. They'll want to know that my marriage won't affect the quality or availability of my remedies." "How many regular customers do you have?" "About 30 in town, plus others who come in from the surrounding ranches. Mrs. Davidson relies on my arthritis remedy, and the Millers buy my cough syrup every winter. Some of them have been buying from me for 3 years now. The pride in her voice was unmistakable, and Calder found himself genuinely impressed. Building a customer base that size in a small town required not just skill, but also trust and reliability, qualities that weren't always easy to come by. "What about your work at the ranch?" Pearl asked. "Will getting married affect your position there?" "Shouldn't," Calder said, though he realized he hadn't really considered the question. "Mr. Richardson's a fair man. As long as I do my job, he doesn't much care about my personal life. But living in town instead of the bunkhouse might make some things more complicated. The early mornings, the long days during roundup season." It was a valid concern. Ranch work didn't follow a regular schedule, especially during busy seasons when 12-hour days were common and emergencies could arise at any time. Living in town would mean a longer commute and less flexibility. "I'll manage," Calder said. "Plenty of married men work the ranches around here." As night fell, they faced the awkward question of sleeping arrangements. The house had 2 bedrooms, but they'd filled one with Pearl's business supplies. The other contained a single bed that had come with the house, adequate for 1 person, but cramped for 2. "I can sleep on the couch," Calder offered. "At least until we can arrange for a larger bed." "That hardly seems fair," Pearl protested. "You're paying half the rent." "I'm also the one who got us into this situation in the first place," Calder reminded her. "The least I can do is take the uncomfortable sleeping arrangements." Pearl considered this for a moment. "We could take turns. Tonight you take the bed, tomorrow night I'll take the couch." It was a practical solution, though Calder suspected neither of them would be entirely comfortable with the arrangement. Still, it was better than the alternative of sharing a bed when they were essentially still strangers. As they prepared for their first night in the house, moving around each other with careful politeness, Calder found himself wondering what Pearl was really thinking about all of this. She'd handled every challenge and awkwardness with remarkable composure, but he couldn't help feeling that she was holding something back, maintaining a careful distance even as they went through the motions of setting up a shared life. "Pearl," he said as she emerged from the bedroom after changing into her nightgown and robe, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you really say yes last night? I told you the truth about the dare. But I get the feeling there's more to your decision than just wanting security and respectability." Pearl paused in the act of arranging blankets on the couch, her hand stilling as she considered his question. When she finally looked at him, her green eyes held a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. "Because," she said quietly, "I was tired of being alone, tired of watching other women my age with husbands and children while I went home to an empty cabin every night. When you asked me to marry you, even though I knew it wasn't about love, I thought maybe it could become something more. Maybe 2 people who respected each other could build something real together." The honesty in her voice made Calder's chest tighten. Here was a woman who'd built a successful business and earned the respect of her community, but who still felt the fundamental loneliness that came from having no one to share her life with. "I hope we can," he said simply. "Build something real, I mean." "So do I," Pearl replied. "So do I." She settled onto the couch with her blankets, and Calder retreated to the bedroom. But sleep came slowly for both of them. The house was full of unfamiliar sounds. The creak of settling wood, the whisper of wind through windows, the distant sound of night birds calling to each other. More than that, though, it was the awareness of another person's presence. The knowledge that they were no longer alone, but not yet truly together. Calder lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, and wondering what tomorrow would bring. Would they continue this careful dance of politeness and practical cooperation? Would the awkwardness fade as they grew more comfortable with each other? Or would the artificial nature of their union become too much to bear? In the front room, Pearl was wrestling with similar questions. She'd been honest with Calder about her reasons for accepting his proposal, but she hadn't told him about the loneliness that sometimes felt like a physical ache, or about the dreams she'd given up on long before he'd walked into the saloon. At 28, she'd resigned herself to spinsterhood, to a life of useful work and quiet solitude. His proposal, ridiculous as its origins were, had offered her a chance at something she'd thought was lost forever. The possibility of a real partnership, maybe even love. But possibility and reality were very different things, and she was all too aware of how much could go wrong. They barely knew each other, had no shared history to fall back on when things got difficult, and no guarantee that respect could grow into anything deeper. She was risking everything she'd built on the chance that a man who'd married her on a dare might somehow become the husband she'd never dared to hope for. The clock in the front room chimed 11, then midnight, then 1. Eventually, exhaustion overcame anxiety, and both Pearl and Calder drifted into fitful sleep, each wondering what the morning would bring, and whether they'd made the best or worst decision of their lives. When dawn broke over Cedar Ridge, it found them in their new house, married in name, if not yet in fact beginning the slow and uncertain process of discovering whether two strangers could indeed build something real together. The next few weeks would test their resolve, their patience, and their growing understanding of what it meant to be partners in this strange new venture they'd embarked upon together. Resaye TS, Part 3. Lưu ý viết 8 niềm nắm nhàn từ liên kết liên mạch với các phần trước. Trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng, hoặc tiêu đề phụ phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính, không viết lan man, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document, modifier 2. The first weeks of their marriage settled into a rhythm that surprised them both with its relative ease. Calder would wake before dawn, dress quietly in the kitchen to avoid disturbing Pearl, and ride out to the Double R Ranch, where the cattle were already stirring in the morning mist. Pearl would rise an hour later, tend to her herb garden, and begin the day's work of mixing remedies and preparing orders for her growing list of customers. Their conversations remained polite and practical, focused on household logistics and daily necessities. Who would stop at the general store for supplies? When would the rent be due? How should they handle the unexpected expense of a broken window latch? They moved around each other with careful consideration, like dancers learning steps to an unfamiliar waltz. Mrs. Davidson stopped by yesterday, Pearl mentioned one evening as they shared another simple dinner of stew and cornbread. She wanted to make sure my marriage wouldn't affect her arthritis remedy. And what did you tell her? Calder asked, genuinely curious about how Pearl was handling the questions from her customers. That my husband supports my work and understands its importance to our community. Pearl's tone was matter-of-fact, but Calder caught the slight emphasis on husband and realized she was still adjusting to the word as much as he was. That's the truth, he said. Your remedies help more people in this town than the doctor does. Pearl looked up from her bowl, surprise flickering across her features. You really believe that? I've seen the difference they make. Tommy Williams swears your liniment saved his shoulder after that bull threw him last month. And Mrs. Henderson's baby stopped crying all night once she started using your colic remedy. The pleasure in Pearl's expression was unmistakable, and Calder realized this might be the first time anyone had genuinely praised her work rather than simply tolerating it as a necessary service. The thought made him uncomfortably aware of how little recognition she'd received for building something meaningful from nothing. Thank you, she said quietly. That means more than you know. Their sleeping arrangement continued to alternate between bed and couch. though both had begun to show signs of strain from the uncomfortable setup. Calder's back ached from the too short sofa, while Pearl struggled with the narrow bed that had clearly been designed for someone much smaller than her substantial frame. "This isn't working," Pearl announced one morning, catching Calder wincing as he straightened from lacing his boots. "We're both miserable and it's affecting our work." "I'm fine," Calder protested, though his grimace suggested otherwise. "You're not fine, and neither am I. We need a better solution." "I could build a larger bed frame," Calder offered. "Buy a bigger mattress to go with it." The suggestion hung between them, loaded with implications they'd both been avoiding. A larger bed meant sharing sleeping space, which felt like crossing a line they'd been carefully approaching but not yet ready to step over. "That seems practical," Pearl said finally, though her cheeks had taken on a pink tinge. "We're married after all. People expect married couples to share a bed." "Only if you're comfortable with it," Calder said quickly. "I don't want you to feel pressured." "I don't," Pearl assured him. "It's just another adjustment to make." The new bed frame took Calder the better part of 2 weekends to complete working in the small shed behind the house, while Pearl mixed remedies in her newly organized workspace. He found the physical labor soothing the familiar rhythm of measuring, cutting, and joining wood, providing a welcome distraction from the complexity of his new domestic situation. "You're skilled with your hands," Pearl observed, watching him sand the headboard to a smooth finish. "Did you learn carpentry before ranching?" "My father was a furniture maker," Calder explained, running his palm along the wood to check for rough spots. "I spent summers in his workshop before I decided I preferred working outdoors." "What made you choose ranching over carpentry?" Calder paused in his work, considering how much of his past he was ready to share. "My father had very specific ideas about how things should be done. His workshop, his rules, his way of measuring success. Ranching gave me the freedom to make my own decisions, even if they were wrong ones." Pearl nodded as if she understood something deeper in his words. "Freedom has its own value, doesn't it? Even when it comes with uncertainty." "Is that why you left Missouri for freedom?" "Partly," Pearl admitted, "but also because staying would have meant becoming someone I didn't want to be. The town wanted my grandmother's replacement, not me as myself." Their conversations were growing deeper, moving beyond the practical necessities of shared living towards something that felt like genuine understanding. Calder found himself looking forward to these exchanges, treasuring the moments when Pearl's careful reserve slipped enough to reveal the intelligent, determined woman underneath. The new mattress arrived on a Thursday, delivered by a bemused store clerk who seemed surprised that the newlyweds had waited nearly a month to buy proper bedding. That evening, they stood awkwardly in the bedroom, contemplating the expanse of white cotton that represented another step toward a more conventional marriage. "It's certainly large enough," Pearl said, her voice overly bright. "Room for both of us without crowding." Calder agreed, equally uncomfortable. "I suppose we should try it out. See if it's comfortable." They approached the bed like it might bite them, each taking a side and settling gingerly onto the new mattress. The space between them felt both vast and negligible, a carefully maintained neutral zone that neither was quite ready to cross. "It's very comfortable," Pearl said, staring resolutely at the ceiling. "Much better than the couch," Calder agreed. They lay in silence for several minutes, the weight of their shared space settling around them like a physical thing. Finally, Pearl spoke into the darkness. "Calder, are you still awake?" "Yes." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd met under different circumstances? Without the dare, I mean." Calder considered the question seriously. "I think I would have been too intimidated to approach you properly. You're accomplished, independent, sure of yourself. I'm just a cowboy who's good with horses and cattle." "You're more than that," Pearl said softly. "You're kind, patient. You listen when people talk, really listen. Those aren't common qualities." Neither is building a business from nothing or having the courage to start over in a new place. You did both of those things on your own. Not entirely on my own anymore, Pearl pointed out. That's still strange to think about. Good strange or bad strange? Pearl was quiet for so long that Calder began to think she'd fallen asleep. When she finally answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. I'm not sure yet. Ask me again in a few months. Sleep came easier that night, though both remained carefully on their respective sides of the bed. In the morning, they woke to find that unconscious sleep had narrowed the space between them, though not enough to actually make contact. It was progress of sorts, a gradual erosion of the walls they'd built around themselves. The routine of their days began to feel more natural as autumn settled over Cedar Ridge. Calder would return from the ranch with stories about difficult cattle and demanding work, while Pearl shared news from her customers and updates on her expanding business. They'd begun planning improvements to the house small projects that suggested they were thinking beyond their 6-month trial period. I've been thinking about expanding the herb garden next spring, Pearl mentioned one evening as they worked together to repair a section of fence. There's demand for remedies I can't make without certain plants that don't grow wild around here. What kind of plants? Calder asked, holding a fence post steady while she secured the wire. Echinacea for infections, valerian for sleeplessness, fever, few for headaches. I could order seeds and rootstock from suppliers back east, but I'd need more garden space. The backyard's plenty big enough. We could clear another section, maybe build some raised beds for better drainage. The casual way he said we sent a warm feeling through Pearl's chest. Somewhere along the way, their arrangement had begun to feel like a true partnership with both of them, invested in their shared future. Their first real test came on a rainy Tuesday in November, when Pearl received the largest order she'd ever gotten. Mrs. Whitmore, who ran the boarding house in the next town over, wanted 50 jars of Pearl's popular rose hand cream for her guests. It was an opportunity that could significantly expand Pearl's business, but it would require working almost around the clock for the next week to meet the deadline. 50 jars. Calder whistled when Pearl showed him the letter. That's quite an order. It's enormous. Pearl agreed, her voice tight with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. If I can fill it successfully, Mrs. Whitmore says she'll recommend my products to other boarding house owners in the region. It could double my business. That's wonderful news, Calder said, though he could see the stress already building in Pearl's shoulders. What do you need to make it happen? Time, mostly, and steady hands. The rose cream is delicate work. The proportions have to be exact, and it has to be mixed at just the right temperature, or it separates. Calder watched Pearl calculate quantities and timing in her head. Her brow furrowed with concentration. He could practically see her working through every possible obstacle and contingency plan. How can I help? He asked. You can't, Pearl said immediately, then caught herself. I mean, this is specialized work. It requires knowledge you don't have. Then teach me, Calder said simply. At least the basic tasks. Surely some of the work doesn't require years of training. Pearl looked skeptical. You work 12-hour days at the ranch. When would you have time to help? I'll talk to Mr. Richardson, explain the situation. He's got enough hands to cover for me for a few days if it means helping my wife's business succeed. The word wife still sent a small thrill through Pearl every time he said it, with such casual acceptance. Here was a man who was willing to risk his own job security to help her achieve something important, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Are you certain? She asked. This could be very tedious work. Pearl, Calder said, taking her hands in his work-roughened ones. Your success is my success now. We're in this together, remember? The next morning brought frantic preparation as Pearl organized ingredients and equipment while Calder negotiated time off from the ranch. Mr. Richardson, a practical man who understood the value of diversified income, readily agreed to give Calder several days to help his wife with her business opportunity. "Smart thinking," the older man said, leaning against the corral fence while his hands worked with the horses. "A man who supports his wife's endeavors usually finds himself better off in the long run." The work proved every bit as demanding as Pearl had predicted. The rose cream required precision timing and careful attention to temperature and texture that couldn't be rushed or approximated. Calder's role was limited to basic tasks like measuring ingredients and sterilizing jars. But his steady presence and willingness to follow Pearl's increasingly frantic instructions proved invaluable. "The temperature's too high," Pearl muttered, stirring a batch that was beginning to look grainy. "It's going to separate if I can't get it to cool down faster." "What if we move the pot to the back porch?" Calder suggested. "The air's cooler there." "Yes, good idea. But carefully, if we jostle it too much while it's unstable." They moved the precious mixture with the care of surgeons Pearl guiding, while Calder provided steady hands and calm reassurance. Watching her work, Calder gained new appreciation for the skill and knowledge required for Pearl's seemingly simple remedies. Every step required judgment calls based on experience and intuition that couldn't be taught in a day. By Wednesday evening, they'd completed 20 jars, but Pearl was beginning to show signs of strain. Her usual steady hands had developed a slight tremor from exhaustion, and her perfectionist tendencies were becoming more pronounced with each batch. "This one's not right," she said, staring at a jar that looked identical to all the others to Calder's untrained eye. "The texture's slightly off. It might not last as long as it should." "It looks fine to me," Calder said gently. "Maybe you're being too critical." "You don't understand," Pearl snapped, then immediately looked stricken. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. It's just that my reputation depends on every jar being perfect. One bad batch and word spreads." "I know," Calder said, his voice patient despite her sharp tone. "But you're exhausting yourself. When was the last time you ate a full meal?" Pearl couldn't remember which was answer enough. Calder insisted she take a break while he prepared dinner, and she was too tired to argue. As she sat at the kitchen table watching him move around their kitchen with growing familiarity, she felt a wave of gratitude that was almost overwhelming. "I don't know how to thank you," she said suddenly. "Thank me for what? For this. For helping with something that has nothing to do with you. For believing in my work enough to risk your own job." Calder paused in his cooking, considering her words. "Pearl, your work has everything to do with me now. We're partners, remember? Your dreams are my dreams." The simple sincerity in his voice brought tears to Pearl's eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. When had she last had someone who believed in her goals as much as she did? When had anyone ever put her success before their own comfort? Thursday brought disaster. Pearl was working on batch number 35 when exhaustion finally caught up with her. The careful routine she'd perfected over dozens of jars faltered for just a moment. But it was enough. Her tired hands fumbled the pot as she lifted it from the stove, and 20 jars worth of perfectly mixed rose cream splattered across the kitchen floor. The silence that followed was deafening. Pearl stood frozen, staring at the ruined mixture that represented hours of work and precious ingredients. The financial loss was significant, but worse was the time they'd lost. With the deadline looming, there might not be enough time to replace the ruined batch. "Oh, no," Pearl whispered, then again louder. "Oh, no. Oh, no. Oh, no." The tears came then born of exhaustion and frustration and the crushing weight of failure. She sank onto a kitchen chair and buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her chest. Calder moved immediately, stepping carefully around the spilled cream to kneel beside her chair. "Pearl, it's going to be all right." "No, it's not," she choked out between sobs. I've ruined everything. The deadline, the order, my reputation. Mrs. Whitmore will never trust me with another order, and she'll tell everyone how unreliable I am. That's not true, Calder said firmly. One accident doesn't erase 3 years of perfect service. You're the most reliable person in this town. I can't afford to replace those ingredients. Pearl continued, her voice rising with panic. And there's not enough time to start over. I've failed completely. When Calder reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, then gently took her hands in his. They were sticky with cream and shaking with exhaustion, but he held them steady. Listen to me, he said, his voice calm and sure. This is not failure. This is one mistake made by someone who's been working 18-hour days to achieve something extraordinary. We're going to clean this up, figure out what we need to replace the lost batch, and then we're going to finish this order together. We don't have enough money for more ingredients, Pearl protested. Yes, we do. I've got savings put aside, and if that's not enough, I'll borrow against next month's wages. This order is too important to give up on now. Pearl looked up at him through her tears, seeing something in his blue eyes that she'd never expected to find there. Not just support or partnership, but genuine care for her success and well-being. He wasn't helping her because he had to, or because it was his duty as her husband. He was helping because her happiness mattered to him. Why? She whispered. Why are you doing all this for me? Calder was quiet for a moment, studying her tear-stained face as if seeing something there he hadn't noticed before. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being about a dare or a practical arrangement. Because watching you work, seeing how much you care about helping people, listening to you talk about your dreams, I realized I want to be part of those dreams. I want to help you build something amazing. The admission hung between them, like a bridge neither had expected to build. Pearl felt her breath catch as the full meaning of his words settled over her. This wasn't just about business partnership anymore. Somewhere in the midst of shared meals and quiet conversations and learning to live together, something deeper had begun to grow. Calder, she started, but he shook his head. You don't have to say anything, he said. Right now, let's just focus on finishing this order. We'll figure out the rest later. They worked through the night, replacing the lost batch with a determination born of shared purpose. Calder proved surprisingly adept at learning the more complex tasks, his steady hands and careful attention to detail, making him a valuable assistant rather than just extra help. As dawn broke over Cedar Ridge, they were putting the finishing touches on jar number 50. Pearl's hands were finally steady again, and the last batch of rose cream had set perfectly. The order was complete, packaged carefully in wooden crates that Calder had built to ensure safe transport. We did it, Pearl said, hardly believing it herself. You did it, Calder corrected. I just helped. No, Pearl said firmly. We did it. Together. They stood in their cream-splattered kitchen, exhausted but triumphant, and for the first time since their wedding night, the space between them seemed to disappear entirely. Pearl reached up to touch Calder's face, her fingers tracing the line of exhaustion around his eyes. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. When Calder leaned down to kiss her, it felt nothing like their awkward wedding kiss. This was soft and warm and full of promise, the kind of kiss that spoke of genuine affection rather than obligation. Pearl melted into it, her arms coming up around his neck as weeks of careful distance finally collapsed. They broke apart slowly, both breathing heavily and staring at each other with new understanding. Something fundamental had shifted between them during those long hours of working together, supporting each other through crisis and celebrating their shared success. Pearl, Calder said, his voice rough with emotion. I think I'm falling in love with you. The words should have frightened her, should have sent her retreating behind the careful walls she'd built around her heart. Instead, Pearl felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the exhaustion or the relief of completing their impossible task. I think I'm falling in love with you too, she whispered back. This time when they kissed, it was with the knowledge that their 6-month trial had become something neither of them had dared to hope for. They were no longer strangers bound by circumstance, but partners choosing each other with full awareness of what they were building together. Resayers Part 4, lưu ý viết chính hình. Trump tự liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại, tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề. Tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ. Phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Modifier The Rose Cream Order's success marked a turning point that rippled through every aspect of their lives. Mrs. Whitmore's enthusiastic recommendation brought inquiries from boarding houses as far away as San Antonio, and Pearl found herself with more business than she'd ever imagined possible. But more than the financial success the crisis had revealed, something precious that neither had expected to find in their practical arrangement. In the days following their confession, Calder and Pearl moved around each other with a new awareness, like two people learning to dance to music they had never heard before. The careful politeness that had marked their early weeks gave way to something warmer, more intimate, though still tentative in its newness. You don't have to sleep on your side of the bed like there's a fence down the middle, Pearl said one morning, watching Calder wake up in his usual position pressed against the far edge of the mattress. I didn't want to presume, he replied, his voice still rough with sleep. Just because things have changed between us doesn't mean I should take liberties. Pearl turned to face him fully, her green eyes serious in the morning light. Calder, what happened between us wasn't just gratitude or exhaustion talking. At least it wasn't for me. No, he agreed, reaching out to touch her face with a gentleness that still surprised them both. It wasn't for me either. Their first real kiss as a couple who'd chosen each other came naturally, then soft and exploratory and full of promise. When they broke apart, Pearl's cheeks were flushed and Calder's breathing had quickened, but neither pulled away. We have time, Pearl said softly, understanding the question in his eyes. We don't have to rush anything. I want this to be right, Calder said. I want you to be sure. I am sure, Pearl replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Not about everything, but about this. About us. The intimacy that developed between them over the following weeks was a revelation for both. Pearl had never known that a man could be gentle and patient, that physical affection could be an extension of emotional trust rather than something to be endured. Calder, for his part, discovered that touching Pearl, holding her, learning the soft curves of her body, felt like coming home to a place he'd never known he was searching for. Their lovemaking. When it finally happened on a cold December evening, with snow falling softly outside their bedroom window, was everything their wedding night should have been, but couldn't be. It was tender and passionate, awkward in some moments, and perfect in others. But most importantly, it was a choice they made together, with full hearts and clear minds. I love you, Pearl whispered afterward, her head pillowed on Calder's shoulder as they lay tangled together beneath the quilts. I never thought I'd be able to say those words to anyone. I love you too, Calder replied, his arms tightening around her. More than I knew it was possible to love someone. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they'd built together. This wasn't the desperate passion of young lovers or the comfortable affection of an arranged marriage. This was something deeper, built on respect and partnership and the kind of trust that grew slowly over shared challenges and quiet moments. Winter settled over Cedar Ridge with unusual severity, bringing blizzards that lasted for days and temperatures that froze the water in the well solid. The harsh weather created new challenges for both of their work lives, but it also provided unexpected opportunities for deeper intimacy as they were forced to spend long hours together inside their warm house. "The Hendersons' baby is sick again," Pearl said one February morning, reading a note that had been slipped under their door despite the howling wind outside. "Mrs. Henderson is asking if I can make a house call." Calder looked up from the harness he was mending by the fire, his expression concerned. "In this weather, Pearl, you can't ride out to their place in a blizzard." "I have to," Pearl said simply. "Little Mary's been fighting a fever for 3 days. If it gets worse..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They'd both seen what could happen to children who couldn't fight off winter illnesses, especially when the doctor was snowed in and couldn't make his rounds. "Then we'll both go," Calder said, setting aside his work. "I'm not letting you ride out alone in this storm." "It's too dangerous for both of us to risk the trip," Pearl protested. "If something happens to us, there's no one else who can help the baby." "And if something happens to you riding alone, there's no one who can help the baby either," Calder countered. "We go together or we don't go at all." The ride to the Henderson farm was harrowing, with snow falling so heavily they could barely see 10 feet ahead and wind that cut through their heaviest coats like knives. But Calder's knowledge of the local terrain and Pearl's determination to reach her patient saw them through, arriving at the farmhouse just as the storm reached its peak intensity. Little Mary Henderson was indeed very sick, burning with fever and struggling to breathe. Pearl worked quickly, preparing a poultice for the child's chest and mixing a fever reducer, while Mrs. Henderson hovered anxiously nearby. "Will she be all right?" the young mother asked, her voice tight with fear. "The fever's high, but it's starting to break," Pearl said, checking the baby's temperature again. "Keep her warm and give her this medicine every 4 hours. If the fever spikes again, or if she has trouble breathing, send for me immediately." "How can we ever thank you?" Mr. Henderson asked, clasping Calder's hand gratefully. "Riding out in weather like this to help our little girl." "Pearl's the one who deserves your thanks," Calder said. "I just made sure she got here safely." The ride home was even more treacherous, with full darkness and worsening conditions, making navigation nearly impossible. At one point, they lost the trail entirely and had to take shelter in an abandoned line shack until the worst of the wind died down. "We could have died out there," Pearl said as they huddled together for warmth in the tiny shelter, their horses stamping restlessly outside. "But we didn't," Calder replied, pulling her closer against his side. "And little Mary's going to be fine, because you were brave enough to help her." "We were brave enough," Pearl corrected. "I couldn't have done it without you." The crisis had revealed something important about their partnership. They weren't just husband and wife in name, or even lovers learning to trust each other. They were true partners, willing to risk everything for each other's values and commitments. Calder's support for Pearl's calling went beyond mere tolerance. He actively enabled her to do work that mattered to her, even when it put them both in danger. Spring's arrival brought not just relief from the harsh winter, but also news that would change their lives forever. Pearl had been feeling unwell for several weeks, experiencing morning nausea and unusual fatigue that she'd initially attributed to the stress of her expanded business and the demanding winter months. "I think I need to see Dr. Morrison," she told Calder one morning after a particularly severe bout of sickness had left her pale and shaky. "What's wrong?" Calder asked immediately, his face creasing with concern. "Are you in pain? Do you think you caught something from one of your patients?" "No, it's not that," Pearl said, a strange expression crossing her face. I think I might be with child." The words hung in the air between them like a thunderclap. Calder went very still, his blue eyes searching Pearl's face for confirmation of what she'd just said. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "Not completely, but the signs are there. I've missed my monthly courses twice now, and the sickness, the fatigue, it all fits." Calder sat down heavily in his chair, running his hands through his hair as he tried to process this unexpected development. A baby. They were going to have a baby. The thought filled him with a mixture of joy and terror that he'd never experienced before. "How do you feel about it?" Pearl asked, her voice carefully neutral. "If it's true, I mean." "Scared," Calder admitted honestly. "Thrilled, completely unprepared. How do you feel?" "The same," Pearl said with a shaky laugh. "I never really thought about having children. I always assumed it wasn't going to happen for me." And now, Pearl placed her hands over her still flat stomach, a soft smile spreading across her face. "Now I can't stop thinking about it. About what he or she will look like, whether they'll have your eyes or mine. What kind of parents we'll be." "We'll be good parents," Calder said with sudden certainty. "We'll love this baby completely, teach them to be kind and strong and honest." "You really think so?" "I know so," Calder said, reaching for her hands. "Look what we've built together in just a few months. If we can turn a marriage based on a dare into something this strong, we can certainly learn how to raise a child together." Dr. Morrison confirmed Pearl's suspicions the following week, estimating that the baby would arrive in late October. The news spread through Cedar Ridge with the speed of wildfire, generating congratulations, advice, and the inevitable speculation about whether the child had been conceived before or after the wedding. "Let them talk," Pearl said, when Mrs. Henley made a pointed comment about the timing during a visit to the general store. "We know the truth, and that's what matters." "Are you sure you're not bothered by the gossip?" Calder asked that evening, as they sat on their front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "I was at first," Pearl admitted, "but then I realized that their opinions don't change anything important. We love each other. We're excited about this baby, and we're building a good life together. Why should I let small-minded gossip diminish any of that?" Her confidence in their relationship, in the life they were creating together, filled Calder with a deep sense of contentment. This woman, who'd once been a stranger, thrust into his life by chance, had become the center of his world, and now she was carrying their child. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer months, though it brought its own challenges. Pearl's morning sickness eventually subsided, but she found herself exhausted by work that had once been easy for her. The physical demands of mixing large batches of remedies became increasingly difficult as her belly grew, forcing them to adapt her business practices. "I can handle the heavy lifting and the stirring," Calder offered one evening as they planned the next day's work. "You focus on the measuring and the technical aspects." "You have your own job," Pearl protested. "Mr. Richardson isn't paying you to spend half your time helping me make hand cream." "Actually," Calder said with a slight smile, "I talked to him about that. He's agreed to let me work part-time through the fall with the understanding that I'll pick up extra hours after the baby comes and you're back to full capacity." Pearl stared at him in amazement. "You arranged that without telling me?" "I wanted to make sure it was possible before I mentioned it. I know how important your work is to you, and I don't want you to have to choose between your business and our baby." The thoughtfulness of his gesture, the way he'd anticipated her concerns and worked to solve them without being asked, moved Pearl to tears. Pregnancy had made her more emotional, but this was deeper than hormonal changes. This was gratitude for a partner who truly understood her and supported her dreams even when they required sacrifice on his part. "Thank you," she whispered, reaching for his hand. "I don't know what I did to deserve you." "You said yes when a crazy cowboy asked you to marry him on a dare," Calder replied, bringing her hand to his lips. Best decision either of us ever made. August brought an unexpected complication when Pearl began experiencing pain and spotting that sent both of them into a panic. Dr. Morrison's examination revealed that she was at risk of losing the baby and would need to remain on strict bed rest for the remainder of her pregnancy. No work, no lifting, no standing for extended periods, the doctor instructed sternly. Mrs. Boonwell, I'm serious about this. Any activity beyond the most basic necessities could endanger both you and the child. The enforced inactivity was torture for Pearl, who'd never been idle for more than a few hours at a time. Watching Calder struggle to maintain both his ranch work and her business while also caring for her needs filled her with frustration and guilt. "This isn't what you signed up for," she said one afternoon as he brought her lunch in bed and prepared to tackle a complicated remedy order on his own. "Taking care of an invalid wife and running a business you never wanted to be part of." "Pearl," Calder said firmly, sitting on the edge of the bed, "stop that. This is exactly what I signed up for when we promised to love each other in sickness and in health for better or worse. You're not an invalid. You're my wife carrying our child, and I'll do whatever it takes to keep you both safe." "But your job, the ranch work you love?" "We'll still be there after our baby is born, healthy and strong. Pearl, nothing matters more to me than you and this child. Nothing." His unwavering devotion during those difficult weeks revealed depths of character that Pearl was still discovering. Calder managed her business with surprising competence, following her detailed instructions to maintain the quality her customers expected, while also handling his own reduced responsibilities at the ranch. The crisis deepened in September, when Pearl began experiencing contractions 2 months early. Dr. Morrison was called in the middle of the night, arriving to find Pearl in significant pain and Calder pacing the kitchen like a caged animal. "The baby's trying to come too soon," the doctor explained after his examination. "We need to try to stop the labor, but I have to be honest with you both. The next few hours will be critical." What followed was the longest night of Calder's life. He sat beside Pearl's bed, holding her hand through waves of pain, while Dr. Morrison worked to stop the premature labor. Pearl's face was pale with exhaustion and fear, but her grip on his hand never wavered. "I'm scared," she whispered during a brief respite between contractions. "I know," Calder replied, smoothing her hair back from her damp forehead. "But you're the strongest person I know. If anyone can get through this, it's you. What if we lose the baby? Then we'll grieve together and try again when you're ready. But I believe we're going to be fine, all three of us." His steady confidence, even in the face of uncertainty, gave Pearl strength she didn't know she possessed. This was what true partnership meant. Not just sharing the good times, but holding each other up when everything threatened to fall apart. Dawn brought the miracle they'd been praying for. The contractions finally stopped, and Dr. Morrison pronounced both mother and baby stable, though he emphasized that Pearl would need to remain on complete bed rest until the baby decided it was truly ready to arrive. 2 more months, Pearl said weakly, exhausted by the night's ordeal. "I don't know if I can stay in this bed for 2 more months." "You can," Calder said with absolute certainty, "and I'll be right here with you every step of the way." The final weeks of Pearl's pregnancy tested every aspect of their relationship. Calder took over complete responsibility for Pearl's business learning skills he'd never imagined needing, while also managing his own work and caring for Pearl's increasingly complex needs. The house became a hub of activity as customers came by for their regular remedies and neighbors stopped in to check on Pearl's progress. "You've become quite the businessman," Pearl observed one evening as Calder showed her the day's receipts and updated her on various customer requests. "Mrs. Davidson says your version of her arthritis remedy actually works better than mine." "That's impossible," Calder replied. "I follow your recipe exactly." Maybe it's not just the recipe, Pearl said thoughtfully. Maybe it's the care and attention you put into making it. You've learned to see this work the way I do. Not just as mixing ingredients, but as helping people feel better. The observation revealed something important about how their partnership had evolved. Calder hadn't just taken over Pearl's work. He'd embraced its purpose and meaning, making it truly his own, while still honoring the standards and values she'd established. October arrived with crisp mornings and the brilliant colors of autumn painting the hills around Cedar Ridge. Pearl had made it to full term, and Dr. Morrison pronounced both mother and baby ready for delivery whenever nature decided it was time. "Any day now," he said after his weekly examination. "Mrs. Boonwell, you've done an excellent job following orders. Your patience and discipline may well have saved this baby's life." "We did it together," Pearl corrected, looking at Calder with eyes full of love and gratitude. "I couldn't have managed any of this without him." Labor began on a Thursday morning with the first frost of the season glittering on the grass outside their bedroom window. Pearl's contractions started slowly, giving them time to prepare and call for Dr. Morrison. But as the day progressed, it became clear that this birth would test every ounce of strength and endurance Pearl had left. "Something's not right," Dr. Morrison said quietly to Calder as evening approached and Pearl's labor intensified without much progress. "The baby seems to be positioned incorrectly. We may need to make some difficult decisions." "What kind of decisions?" Calder asked, though he suspected he didn't want to hear the answer. "If the baby doesn't turn soon, we may have to choose between saving Mrs. Boonwell or saving the child. I want you to think about that possibility, as difficult as it is." The words hit Calder like a physical blow. After everything they'd been through, after building this beautiful life together, the possibility of losing Pearl was unthinkable. But the thought of losing their child, the baby they'd already learned to love, was equally devastating. "Is there anything we can try first?" he asked desperately. "A few things, but they're risky. And if they don't work?" "Then we try them," Calder said without hesitation. "Pearl would never forgive either of us if we didn't try everything possible to save this baby." The next few hours were a blur of medical procedures and desperate hope as Dr. Morrison attempted to turn the baby manually. Pearl endured pain that would have broken a weaker person, but her determination to bring their child safely into the world never wavered. "I can feel the baby moving," she gasped during one particularly intense procedure. "I think it's working." "Yes," Dr. Morrison said with obvious relief. "The head is turning. Mrs. Boonwell, you're going to need to push with everything you have left." What followed was the most intense experience of both their lives. Pearl summoned strength from reserves she didn't know she possessed, while Calder provided every ounce of support and encouragement he could offer. When their baby's first cry finally filled the room, it was the most beautiful sound either of them had ever heard. "It's a girl," Dr. Morrison announced, placing the squirming, red-faced infant on Pearl's chest. "A perfectly healthy baby girl." Pearl looked down at their daughter, with tears streaming down her face, unable to speak for the overwhelming emotion of the moment. Calder touched the baby's tiny hand, with one finger amazed by how something so small could already feel so precious and important. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "She looks just like you." "She has your eyes," Pearl replied, studying their daughter's face with wonder. "Look at those blue eyes." "What should we call her?" Calder asked. They'd discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but had never quite settled on anything that felt exactly right. Now, looking at their daughter's face, the answer seemed obvious. "Hope," Pearl said softly. "Her name is Hope." It was perfect. This child who'd survived against all odds, who'd brought them closer together through months of fear and uncertainty, who represented everything good and promising about their future together. Hope was exactly the right name for her. As Dr. Morrison cleaned up and prepared to leave, Calder and Pearl sat together on their bed, taking turns holding their daughter and marveling at the tiny miracle they'd created together. The long journey from their wedding night, dare to this moment of perfect happiness, seemed almost impossible to believe. Do you ever think about how different our lives would be if I'd backed down from Jake's dare that night? Calder asked, watching Hope's tiny fingers curl around Pearl's thumb. Sometimes, Pearl admitted. But then I remember that we found each other when we both needed it most. Maybe it wasn't chance at all. Maybe it was meant to be. You really believe that? I believe that love can grow in the most unexpected places, between the most unlikely people, Pearl said, looking up at him, with eyes that held all the warmth and certainty in the world. And I believe that what we have now is worth every moment of uncertainty it took to find it. Calder leaned down to kiss her forehead, then their daughters sealing this moment of perfect contentment in his memory forever. Outside their window, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall. But inside their house, warmth and love and hope filled every corner. Reessaye TS Part 5. Lưu ý viết tan chim nhàn tự liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện pha hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ Hoa Kỳ giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kệ theo ngôi thứ ba, giữ đồ kịch tính, không viết lần màn kết thúc, phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Modifier Their daughter's arrival transformed the house on Maple Street into something neither Pearl nor Calder had quite anticipated. The quiet rhythms of their married life gave way to the demanding schedule of a newborn. But instead of feeling burdened by the constant needs of their tiny daughter, they found themselves marveling at how naturally they fell into the roles of devoted parents. Hope proved to be a surprisingly easy baby once she recovered from the trauma of her difficult birth. She slept for reasonable stretches, nursed well, and seemed to possess an alert curiosity about the world around her that reminded them both of Pearl's intense focus and Calder's quiet observation of everything happening in his environment. She's watching everything, Pearl observed one morning as she nursed Hope near the kitchen window. Look at how she follows the movement of the tree branches outside. Smart baby, Calder said, pausing in his preparation of Pearl's breakfast to stroke Hope's downy hair. Takes after her mother. And stubborn like her father, Pearl added with a smile, noting how Hope's tiny fist gripped her finger with determined strength. The early weeks of parenthood brought challenges they hadn't anticipated. Pearl's recovery from the difficult birth was slower than expected, leaving her weak and sometimes dizzy when she tried to do too much too quickly. Calder took over nearly all the household responsibilities, while also attempting to maintain Pearl's business and his own reduced hours at the ranch. "You're exhausting yourself," Pearl said one evening as she watched Calder clean up after dinner, tend to Hope's evening routine, and prepare ingredients for the next day's remedy orders all at the same time. "This isn't sustainable." "I'm managing fine," Calder protested, though the dark circles under his eyes suggested otherwise. "No, you're not. And I'm not helping anyone by lying in bed feeling guilty about everything you're trying to handle alone." Pearl shifted Hope to her shoulder and stood up carefully, testing her strength. "It's time for me to start doing more." Dr. Morrison said you needed at least 6 weeks of recovery time. Dr. Morrison doesn't understand that sitting idle while my husband works himself to death isn't actually restful, Pearl replied with the first hint of her old decisiveness. "I can handle light work, measuring ingredients, mixing small batches, taking orders from customers." The compromise they reached allowed Pearl to gradually resume her business activities, while Calder continued handling the physical demands of production and delivery. It was a delicate balance that required constant adjustment as they learned to work around Hope's needs and Pearl's continuing recovery. Mrs. Davidson stopped by today. Pearl reported one afternoon as Calder returned from delivering remedies to customers in town. She wanted to congratulate us on Hope and to place an order for her arthritis remedy. But she also asked if we'd considered expanding our offerings. Expanding how? Calder asked, settling into his chair and reaching for Hope, who immediately began making the happy gurgling sounds she reserved for her father. She's been talking to other women about my remedies, and several of them are interested in things I don't currently make. Headache powders, digestive tonics, even beauty preparations beyond the hand cream. The possibility intrigued Calder more than he'd expected. Over the months of working with Pearl's business, he'd developed genuine appreciation for the skill and knowledge required to create effective remedies. More than that, he'd seen how much their products meant to people who couldn't always afford or access traditional medical care. "Do you have the recipes for those kinds of preparations?" he asked. "Some of them. My grandmother's collection included treatments for almost everything, though I've never had enough demand to make it worthwhile to produce the more specialized items." And now, Pearl smiled, the expression lighting up her whole face. "Now we have a reputation for quality and reliability. People trust our products. If we could expand, gradually testing demand for new items without overextending ourselves." "It sounds like a solid business plan," Calder said, impressed by how thoroughly Pearl had thought through the implications. "What would we need to make it work?" "More space for one thing. The kitchen setup was adequate when I was working alone and making small batches. But if we're going to expand, we need a proper workshop. And we'd need to invest in better equipment, larger quantities of raw materials, maybe even hire help during busy periods." The scope of what Pearl was proposing was ambitious, but Calder found himself getting excited about the possibilities. This wasn't just about expanding a small business. It was about building something significant that could provide real security for their growing family. "The shed behind the house could be converted into a workshop," he said thoughtfully. "It's large enough, and we could add windows for better light and ventilation." "Amas? You'd be willing to take on that much construction work?" "I'd be willing to take on anything that helps you build the business you're dreaming of," Calder replied simply. Their conversation was interrupted by Hope's demanding cry. But as Pearl settled down to nurse their daughter, both of them were already planning the future they wanted to create together. The months that followed were filled with careful expansion and gradual growth as they transformed Pearl's cottage industry into something approaching a real business enterprise. The workshop conversion took most of the winter, with Calder working on construction during his free time while Pearl managed orders and cared for Hope. The project brought unexpected challenges, from finding the right materials during the coldest months of the year to designing workflow patterns that would accommodate both efficiency and safety. "I think we need the mixing station over here," Pearl said one February afternoon, standing in the half-finished workshop with Hope bundled against the cold in her arms. "That way, the light from the south window will help with color matching, and we'll have easy access to both the storage area and the cleaning station." "That means moving the heavy equipment again," Calder pointed out, though his tone was patient rather than frustrated. "I know. I'm sorry. I keep changing my mind about the layout." "Don't apologize," Calder said, pausing in his work to really look at her. "This is your space. It needs to work exactly the way you want it to work. We'll move things as many times as necessary to get it right." His unwavering support for her vision, even when it meant extra work for him, continued to amaze Pearl. In her previous life, she'd grown accustomed to making do with whatever space and equipment she could manage. Having a partner who not only supported her ambitions, but actively worked to make them reality, felt like an incredible luxury. Spring brought the completion of the workshop and the first major test of their expanded capabilities. Word of their growing business had spread beyond Cedar Ridge, and they received an order from a hotel in San Antonio for an assortment of remedies and toiletries that would require them to produce larger quantities than they'd ever attempted. 50 bottles of headache powder, 30 jars of digestive tonic, 40 bottles of hand cream, and 20 containers of tooth powder. Pearl read from the order letter. It's more than 3 times our usual monthly production. Can we handle it? Calder asked, though he was already mentally calculating the time and materials they'd need. With the new workshop and equipment, yes. But it means working longer days and being very careful about quality control. One bad batch could ruin our reputation with commercial customers. Then we'll make sure every batch is perfect, Calder said with the quiet confidence that Pearl had learned to rely on. We've handled challenges before. The San Antonio order became a turning point for their business. Working together in the new workshop, they developed production methods that were both efficient and reliable. Calder's attention to detail and Pearl's expertise created a partnership that consistently produced high-quality results even under pressure. I think we should consider hiring help, Pearl said one evening as they finished packaging the completed order. Not for the skilled work, but for the basic tasks. Cleaning equipment, preparing raw materials, packaging finished products. Anyone in mind? Actually, yes. Sarah Miller has been looking for work since her husband's injury, and she's always been reliable and careful. She helped her mother with cooking and preserving, so she understands the importance of cleanliness and precision. The decision to hire their first employee felt momentous, marking the transition from a husband and wife working together to actual business owners with responsibilities to others. Sarah Miller proved to be an excellent choice, bringing energy and enthusiasm to the work, while freeing Pearl and Calder to focus on the more technical aspects of production. I never imagined this, Pearl said one summer afternoon as she watched Sarah efficiently clean and organize equipment, while Calder prepared materials for the next day's production run. A year ago, I was working alone in my cabin, making just enough to support myself. Now we have employees and commercial contracts and plans for further expansion. Are you happy with how everything's developed? Calder asked, noting something wistful in her tone. More than happy, Pearl assured him. It's just overwhelming sometimes how much our lives have changed. Sometimes I look at Hope playing in her basket or watch you teaching Sarah the proper way to measure ingredients, and I can barely believe this is all real. It's real, Calder said, reaching for her hand. And it's just the beginning. We're building something that will last, something we can pass on to Hope when she's old enough. The thought of their daughter inheriting not just a business, but a legacy of hard work and mutual support filled both of them with pride and determination. They were creating more than financial security. They were demonstrating that two people who respected and loved each other could build something meaningful together. Hope's first birthday in October was celebrated with a gathering that would have been impossible during their early days of careful politeness. The house filled with friends and neighbors who'd watched their family grow and their business flourish. Mrs. Davidson brought her famous apple cake. The Hendersons contributed fresh butter and cream, and even Jake Morrison appeared with a hand-carved toy horse for Hope. Hard to believe it all started with a dare in the saloon, Jake said to Calder as they watched Hope toddle around the parlor, delighting in the attention from her many admirers. Best dare I ever took, Calder replied, watching Pearl laugh at something Mrs. Henderson had said while simultaneously keeping an eye on Hope's progress across the room. You two really made it work. Jake continued, his voice unusually serious. Not everyone could have done what you did, building a real marriage out of what it started as. We got lucky, Calder said. We found out we actually liked each other. It was more than luck, Jake insisted. You both put in the work to make it something good. That takes character. The conversation was interrupted by Hope's delighted shriek as she discovered the toy horse Jake had brought her, but his words stayed with Calder throughout the evening. They had put in the work, both of them choosing again and again to build something together rather than merely coexist in the same space. As winter approached, bringing with it the second anniversary of their wedding, Pearl made an announcement that surprised even herself. "I think I might be pregnant again," she told Calder one evening as they cleaned up after dinner while Hope played with her toys on the kitchen floor. Calder went very still, his hands pausing in their work. "Are you sure?" "Not completely, but the signs are there. The nausea, the fatigue, the way certain smells make me feel sick." "How do you feel about it?" Calder asked, echoing the conversation they'd had with Hope's pregnancy, but with very different emotions underlying the question. "Excited," Pearl said without hesitation. "Nervous about managing the business with 2 children, but excited. Hope should have siblings, and we're in a much better position now to handle the challenges." "We certainly are." Calder agreed, thinking of their successful business, their comfortable home, and the deep partnership they'd built over the past 2 years. "When do you think?" "Early summer, if I'm right about the timing." Dr. Morrison confirmed Pearl's suspicions a week later. But this pregnancy felt completely different from their anxious experience with Hope. They were confident in their relationship, secure in their financial situation, and experienced enough as parents to feel prepared for the challenges ahead. "Everything looks excellent," Dr. Morrison reported after his examination. "Mrs. Boonwell, you're obviously much healthier this time around. And your previous experience gives us a good baseline for monitoring your progress." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter and spring months. Pearl continued working in the business with only minor adjustments, while Calder took on more of the physical demands, and Sarah expanded her responsibilities to cover areas Pearl found increasingly difficult to manage. "We'll need to think about childcare arrangements," Pearl said one April morning as she watched Hope play, while simultaneously reviewing orders and planning production schedules. 2 children will be more demanding than 1, and we can't expect Sarah to manage business tasks and babysitting at the same time. "My sister mentioned that she might be interested in moving closer to family," Calder said thoughtfully. "She's been widowed for 2 years now, and her children are grown. She might welcome the chance to help with Hope and the new baby while earning some income." The suggestion proved perfect. Mary Boonwell arrived in Cedar Ridge in May, bringing energy and experience that immediately improved their household management. She adored Hope, understood the demands of business ownership, and possessed the kind of practical wisdom that came from raising her own children successfully. "It's like having a mother again," Pearl confided to Calder one evening as they listened to Mary singing lullabies to Hope upstairs. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone else invested in our family's well-being." "She's happy to have a purpose again," Calder replied. "And Hope adores her. The timing couldn't be better. I was starting to worry about how we'd manage everything once the new baby arrives." Their second child arrived on a warm June morning with none of the drama that had marked Hope's birth. Thomas James Boonwell entered the world quickly and efficiently, as if eager to join the busy household he'd been listening to for months. "A son," Pearl said wonderingly as she held the red-faced infant against her chest. "Hope's going to have a little brother." "He's perfect," Calder said, touching the baby's tiny hand with the same gentle reverence he'd shown with Hope. "Look at those long fingers. Maybe he'll have your talent for precise work." "Or your strength for building things," Pearl replied. "Either way, he's going to grow up knowing he's loved and valued." The house that had once felt too large for 2 careful strangers now bustled with the comfortable chaos of a thriving family. Hope, now walking steadily and beginning to talk, appointed herself Thomas's protector and helper, insisting on being involved in every aspect of his care. "Baby hungry?" she would announce solemnly when Thomas began to fuss, leading Pearl to the rocking chair and climbing up to watch the nursing process with fascination. "She's going to be a wonderful big sister," Mary observed, watching Hope gently pat Thomas's back during his feeding. "She's going to be a wonderful person," Pearl replied, pride evident in her voice. Both of them are. They're growing up in a house full of love and purpose. The business continued to flourish despite the demands of 2 young children. Their reputation for quality and reliability had spread throughout the region, bringing orders from as far away as Austin and Houston. They'd hired 2 additional workers and were considering opening a small storefront in town to serve local customers more efficiently. 5 years ago, I was alone in a cabin, making just enough to survive, Pearl said one evening as she and Calder reviewed the accounts after putting the children to bed. Now we employ 4 people, serve customers across 3 counties, and have enough saved to consider buying property for expansion. 5 years ago, I was a bachelor cowboy with no prospects beyond my next paycheck, Calder replied. Now, I'm a husband and father with a family I adore and work that feels meaningful. Now, do you ever miss it? The simplicity of ranch work, the freedom of having no responsibilities beyond yourself? Calder considered the question seriously. Sometimes I miss the quieter moments, the peaceful hours on horseback watching cattle graze. But I wouldn't trade what we have now for anything. This life we've built together, chaotic as it sometimes gets, is everything I never knew I wanted. Their 3rd anniversary passed with quiet celebration, marked more by mutual appreciation than elaborate ceremony. They'd moved far beyond the careful politeness and gradual attraction of their early marriage into something deeper and more solid. They were true partners now in every sense of the word, sharing not just their daily lives, but their dreams and fears and hopes for the future. I have something to tell you, Pearl said one October evening as they sat on their front porch watching Hope chase fireflies in the yard while Thomas dozed in his father's arms. Good news or concerning news? Calder asked, noting the particular tone in her voice that usually preceded important announcements. Good news, I think, though it complicates our plans somewhat. Pearl paused, gathering her thoughts. Dr. Morrison confirmed it today. We're going to have another baby. Calder's eyebrows rose in surprise. Already Thomas is only 4 months old. I know. It's sooner than we planned, but apparently these things don't always follow our preferred timeline. How do you feel about it? Overwhelmed, Pearl admitted. 3 children under 3 years old is going to be challenging, but also grateful. We're blessed to have healthy children and the means to support them properly. We'll manage, Calder said with quiet confidence. We always do. As if to demonstrate their adaptability, Hope chose that moment to trip and fall, scraping her knee on the wooden porch steps. Both parents moved immediately, Pearl scooping up their crying daughter, while Calder shifted Thomas to one arm and reached for the medicinal supplies they now kept readily available for such incidents. Let Mama look at it, Pearl soothed, examining the minor scrape while Calder distracted Hope with silly faces. It's not too bad. We'll clean it up and put some healing salve on it. Kiss better? Hope asked, hopefully, her tears already subsiding. Absolutely, Pearl said, carefully cleaning the wound before applying a thin layer of her own healing preparation. Mama's special medicine and Papa's kisses. You'll be good as new. The domestic scene played out countless times in the past year, illustrated how naturally they'd grown into their roles as parents and partners. They moved around each other with practiced efficiency, each knowing instinctively what needed to be done and how best to accomplish it together. We're pretty good at this, Calder observed as they settled Hope down with a story and prepared to take Thomas inside for his evening feeding. We are, Pearl agreed. Sometimes I'm amazed by how well we work together, considering how we started. Maybe that's exactly why we work so well together, Calder suggested. We had to build everything from scratch, figure out how to be partners without any preconceived notions about how marriage was supposed to work. You think if we'd married for love, in the traditional way, we might not have learned to cooperate as effectively. I think we might have taken each other for granted, Calder said thoughtfully. When you start with nothing and have to build it all together, you don't forget how precious it is. As they settled into their evening routine, Pearl reflected on the truth of his observation. Their marriage had required conscious effort and daily choice in ways that might not have been necessary if they'd begun with overwhelming passion or family expectations. They'd learned to value each other's contributions, to communicate clearly about problems and goals, and to see their relationship as something that required ongoing attention and care. The years that followed brought both expected challenges and unexpected joys. Their third child, Elizabeth Rose, arrived the following spring with a determination that suggested she was ready to hold her own in a household full of energetic siblings. Pearl's business evolved into one of the most successful enterprises in the county, while Calder found himself increasingly involved in community leadership as their reputation for fairness and reliability spread. "The town council wants me to run for mayor," Calder told Pearl one evening as they sat in their expanded parlor, watching their 3 children play together on the rug. "What did you tell them?" "That I'd need to discuss it with my business partner and wife before making any commitments." Pearl smiled at the formality of his language, though she understood the serious consideration behind it. Being mayor would mean less time for the business and more time dealing with politics and public disputes. It would also mean having a voice in decisions that affect our family and our community. The water rights issues, the railroad negotiations, the school funding questions. "You'd be good at it," Pearl said, after a moment's consideration. "You listen to people, you're fair in your judgments, and you understand both business needs and family concerns." "You really think so?" "I know so. The question is whether you want to take on that level of responsibility." "I think I do," Calder said slowly. "I keep thinking about the kind of community we want our children to grow up in, the kinds of opportunities we want them to have. Maybe this is one way to help shape that future." Election day brought a landslide victory that surprised no one who knew Calder's reputation for integrity and common sense. His inauguration as mayor of Cedar Ridge marked another milestone in their unlikely journey from strangers bound by a dare to pillars of their community. "Mayor Boonwell," Pearl said that evening, trying out the title with obvious pleasure. "It has a nice sound to it." "Mrs. Boonwell, successful businesswoman and wife of the mayor," Calder replied. "That sounds even better." As they stood together on their front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, while their children played safely in the yard they'd created together, both marveled at the unexpected paths their lives had taken. "If someone had told me that night in the saloon that this is where we'd end up," Calder set his arm around Pearl's waist as she leaned against his shoulder, "I never would have believed them. If someone had told me that accepting a marriage proposal from a stranger would lead to the happiest years of my life, I would have thought they were crazy," Pearl replied. "Are they the happiest years of your life?" "Without question," Pearl said, turning to face him fully. "Every single day with you and our children has been better than I ever dared to hope for." Their kiss was interrupted by Hope's delighted squeal as she successfully caught a butterfly, and Elizabeth's determined crawl toward the porch steps, and Thomas's urgent need for attention from his parents. The beautiful chaos of their family life surrounded them like a warm embrace, evidence of everything they'd built together, from the foundation of mutual respect and growing love. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they gathered their children and headed inside to the house that had become the center of their world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, more decisions to make together, more dreams to pursue as partners in every sense of the word. But tonight, they were content to be exactly where they were, surrounded by the laughter and love and hope they'd created together, living proof that the most unlikely beginnings could grow into the most beautiful endings. The years rolled by like seasons, changing each one, bringing new depth to the love that had begun as a dare in a dusty saloon. Cedar Ridge itself had grown around the Boonwell family, transforming from a rough frontier town into a thriving community that drew settlers and businesses from across Texas. The railroad had finally arrived, bringing with it opportunities and challenges that tested Calder's leadership as mayor and expanded Pearl's business beyond anything they'd originally imagined. On a crisp morning in early spring, 10 years after that fateful wedding night, Pearl stood in the doorway of their expanded workshop, watching her eldest daughter Hope, now 11, carefully measure ingredients for a batch of headache powder. The girl's movements were precise and confident, displaying the same attention to detail that had made Pearl's remedies famous throughout the region. "Remember what we learned about the willow bark extract?" Pearl instructed gently. "Too little and it won't be effective too much, and it becomes bitter." "I know, Mama," Hope replied with the patient tone of a child who'd heard the same instructions countless times. "Grandmother Mary taught me the same thing yesterday when we made the cough syrup." Pearl smiled at this mention of Calder's sister, who had become such an integral part of their family that the children called her Grandmother Mary, despite the technical incorrectness of the title. Mary had proven invaluable not just in caring for the children, but in helping to preserve and expand the knowledge that formed the foundation of their business. Mrs. Whitmore sent another order. Hope continued consulting the ledger with the seriousness of someone far older than her years. She wants 50 bottles of the new lavender sleep tonic and 30 jars of the rose hand cream plus 20 containers of the tooth powder. "That's quite a large order," Pearl observed. "What did you tell her about delivery time?" 2 weeks like always. "But Mama, I've been thinking about something." Hope paused in her measuring, her young face serious with the weight of her thoughts. "Why don't we have our own store in town? People are always coming out here to place orders or pick up remedies. Wouldn't it be easier if they could just go to a shop on Main Street?" The suggestion wasn't entirely new. Pearl and Calder had discussed the possibility several times over the years, but other priorities had always taken precedence. Now, hearing it from their daughter's perspective, the idea took on fresh appeal. "It's an interesting thought," Pearl said carefully. "What made you think of it?" "Yesterday, when I was helping Papa at the town hall, Mrs. Davidson came by asking if she could place an order for her arthritis remedy. She had to walk all the way out here in the rain because she'd run out and was in terrible pain. If we had a store in town, she could have gotten what she needed right away." The compassion in Hope's voice, her instinctive understanding that their business was about helping people rather than just making money, filled Pearl with pride. This was what she and Calder had tried to model for their children. The idea that success meant using your abilities to make other people's lives better. "What would you think about running such a store?" Pearl asked, curious about her daughter's response. Hope's eyes lit up with excitement. "Could I really? I know all the remedies now, and I'm good with numbers. And I like talking to people about what they need." "You'd need to finish your education first," Pearl said diplomatically, "and learn more about the business side of things. But yes, someday I think you'd be excellent at running a store." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas and Elizabeth, now 9 and 8 respectively, arguing loudly about whose turn it was to feed the chickens. Both children had inherited their parents' strong personalities, which meant their disagreements could be both passionate and persistent. "It's Thomas's turn," Elizabeth declared with the absolute certainty of someone who never doubted her own righteousness. "I fed them yesterday and the day before because he was too busy playing with his wooden soldiers." "I was not playing," Thomas protested indignantly. "I was practicing military formations like Uncle Jake taught me. That's educational, not playing." "Children," Pearl intervened before the argument could escalate further. "The chickens don't care whose turn it is. They just want to be fed. Why don't you do it together and then come help Hope with the packaging?" The compromise worked as Pearl's suggestions usually did. She'd learned over the years that most conflicts could be resolved by redirecting energy towards shared goals, rather than trying to determine who was right or wrong. As the morning progressed, the workshop filled with the comfortable sounds of family working together. Hope continued her careful measuring, while Thomas and Elizabeth took turns reading aloud from the order list and gathering the appropriate containers. Pearl moved between stations, checking quality and offering guidance. But increasingly, she found herself simply observing the smooth efficiency her children had developed. "We make a good team," she said as they finished packaging the morning's production. "The best team," Elizabeth declared with characteristic enthusiasm. "When I grow up, I'm going to invent new remedies that nobody's ever thought of before." "And I'm going to be a soldier and protect people," Thomas added. "But I'll still help with the business when I'm not fighting battles." "What about you, Hope?" Pearl asked. "What do you want to do when you grow up?" Hope considered the question seriously, her young face thoughtful. "I want to do what you do, Mama. Help people feel better, run a business that matters, have a family that works together, but maybe make it even bigger so we can help even more people." The simple ambition stated with such clarity and purpose moved Pearl more than she'd expected. Here was her daughter, not yet 12 years old, already understanding that success meant more than personal achievement. She wanted to build on what her parents had created, to take their legacy and expand it in ways that would benefit even more people. "That's a beautiful dream," Pearl said softly. "And I think you're exactly the right person to make it happen." The afternoon brought Calder home from his mayoral duties, carrying news that would change their family's trajectory once again. The railroad company had approached the town council about establishing a major freight depot in Cedar Ridge, which would bring significant economic opportunities, but also require careful planning to maintain the community's character. "They want to build a warehouse district on the south side of town," Calder explained as the family gathered for dinner. "It would mean jobs for at least 50 people, plus all the indirect business that comes with increased rail traffic." "That sounds wonderful," Pearl said. "What's the concern?" "The concern is that rapid growth can change a community in ways that aren't always positive. We need to make sure we're growing thoughtfully, preserving what makes Cedar Ridge special, while still taking advantage of new opportunities." "Like what kinds of opportunities?" Hope asked, always interested in discussions about business and planning. "Well, for instance, a freight depot would make it much easier to ship your mother's remedies to customers in other states. Instead of relying on individual orders, we could potentially supply stores and pharmacies across the region." The possibility sent excitement rippling through Pearl's mind. She'd always limited her business to what could be produced locally and shipped individually, but access to major freight lines would open up entirely new markets. "We'd need to expand production significantly," she said thoughtfully. "And we'd need to maintain quality control even with larger volumes. It's an exciting possibility, but also a significant challenge." "We could do it," Hope said with the confidence of youth. "We know how to make everything perfectly already. We just need to make more of it." "It's more complicated than that," Calder said gently. "Larger production means more employees, more equipment, more raw materials, more coordination. It would change the nature of your mother's business quite dramatically." "But it would also mean helping more people," Elizabeth pointed out. "And isn't that what we're supposed to do? Help as many people as possible?" The 8-year-old's simple logic cut straight to the heart of the matter. Pearl and Calder had built their business on the principle of using their abilities to improve other people's lives. If they had the opportunity to extend that impact, didn't they have an obligation to try? "You're right," Pearl said finally. "If we can help more people without compromising quality, then we should at least explore the possibility." "What would it mean for our family?" Thomas asked, ever practical, despite his young age. "Would Papa still be mayor? Would we still live in the same house?" "Those are excellent questions," Calder replied. "And they're exactly the kinds of things we'd need to figure out together. Any major change would affect all of us, so all of us should have a voice in deciding what we want to do. The dinner conversation continued late into the evening, with each family member contributing ideas and concerns about the potential expansion. It was the kind of discussion that had become natural in their household, where even the youngest children were encouraged to think seriously about important decisions. As they prepared for bed, Pearl and Calder found themselves alone for the first time all day, finally able to speak privately about the opportunities and challenges ahead. "What do you really think about the railroad proposal?" Pearl asked as they settled into their bedroom, the familiar comfort of their shared space providing a haven for honest conversation. "I think it represents everything we've worked toward," Calder said thoughtfully. "The chance to build something meaningful that extends beyond our immediate community. But I also think it would fundamentally change our lives in ways we can't fully predict. Are you ready for that kind of change? Are you?" Pearl considered the question seriously. 10 years ago, she'd been a single woman making remedies in a small cabin focused entirely on basic survival. Now she was a wife, mother, and business owner, with opportunities she could never have imagined. The prospect of further growth was both thrilling and daunting. "I think I am," she said finally. "Not because I need more success or recognition, but because I keep thinking about all the people we could help if we had the resources to reach them. Even if it means less time together as a family, more travel, more employees to manage more complexity in our daily lives." "Even then," Pearl said with growing certainty, "because look what we've already accomplished by taking risks together. If we can maintain our values and our commitment to each other, I believe we can handle whatever challenges come with growth." Calder reached for her hand, marveling as he always did at the strength and determination of the woman who'd said yes to his desperate proposal so many years ago. "Then we'll explore it seriously. Talk to the railroad people, develop a real plan, see if we can make it work without losing what matters most." "What matters most?" "This," Calder said, simply gesturing toward the sounds of their children settling down for sleep in the next rooms. "Our family, our love for each other, our commitment to doing good work that helps people. Everything else is just details." The following months brought intensive planning and preparation as Pearl and Calder worked with railroad representatives, business advisors, and community leaders to develop a comprehensive expansion plan. The process revealed both the magnitude of the opportunity and the complexity of executing it successfully. "We'd need to hire at least 20 additional employees," Pearl reported after a particularly lengthy planning session. "And we'd need to build a proper manufacturing facility, not just expand the current workshop. The railroad company is willing to provide favorable shipping rates for the first 3 years," Calder added. "And they'll help with connecting us to potential customers in other markets." "What about quality control?" Hope asked, continuing to demonstrate the business sense that impressed all the adults involved in the planning. "How do we make sure 20 employees can produce remedies that meet our standards?" "That's the most important question," Pearl agreed. "We'd need to develop detailed procedures for every step of production, train supervisors thoroughly, and implement testing protocols to catch any problems before products leave our facility." The planning process took nearly a year, but it resulted in a comprehensive strategy that addressed every concern the family had raised. More importantly, it gave them confidence that they could pursue significant growth while maintaining the values and standards that had made their business successful. "I think we're ready," Pearl announced one evening as they reviewed the final plans. "It's ambitious, it's challenging, and it's a little frightening. But I believe we can do it. Together." Calder added the word, carrying all the weight of their shared history and commitment to their future. "Together." Pearl agreed, sealing their decision with a kiss that held all the love and trust they'd built over the years since that improbable beginning in a frontier saloon. The expansion, when it finally began, transformed not just their business, but their entire family's role in the community. Pearl became known throughout Texas as a leading businesswoman whose products improved lives across the state. Calder's leadership in managing the community aspects of growth earned him recognition as one of the most effective mayors in the region. Their children grew up understanding that success meant responsibility, that privilege carried obligation, and that the greatest achievements came from working together toward goals larger than personal gain. Standing in their expanded facility 5 years later, watching dozens of employees carefully producing remedies that would help thousands of people, Pearl often thought back to that night when a stranger had asked her to marry him on a dare. The woman who'd said yes had been hoping for security and respectability. She could never have imagined that her acceptance would lead to a love story that transformed not just 2 lives, but an entire community, creating a legacy that would continue growing for generations to come.